Hello. Welcome back to Lauren's podcast, where we talk about communication law. We talk about precedents that current court cases are decided among, and we give our opinions about these things because it's very important, and I find it really interesting to discuss how precedent really can sway and impact the way that current court cases are decided. So today we're going to talk about political speech, and I think that political speech is very interesting. It's definitely changed over the years, and it has become more important, specifically because the more politicized our country becomes, the more difficult it is for precedented cases to be upheld. I think specifically whenever technology is involved and the way in which we can talk about our political opinions and specifically give political campaigns or political broadcasting, it's definitely changed over the last few decades. So in today's podcast, we're going to discuss the ever-changing political rules and regulations that broadcasting networks have had to uphold throughout the past few decades. This discussion is going to specifically talk about how not all precedented cases are set in stone. While they can still have really concrete set in stone arguments on the fundamental level, certain things can always be changed about any court case, and things can be overruled a lot. Sometimes the more recent case that comes across to the Supreme Court will poke holes and call for a different judgment and call for change, more importantly. So this podcast is going to be a little bit different because we're actually going to talk about 3 court cases. It can get a little bit complex and confusing. I'm going to have some visuals over here on the side to help us follow along with some of the different sections of different acts that I'm going to talk about, some different rules and regulations that are going to be kind of cross-applied to each case as we discuss it. And yeah, so I'm just going to simplify and go over some things. I got my main source of information from OYES. They're a free law project from Cornell. They really help me simplify and get the highlights of a lot of these cases. And I find them to be very helpful and really unbiased, very interesting, honestly. And so let's go ahead and talk about the first case that is going to lay the foundation for political broadcasting as we know it in the United States. So the first case is Austin v. Michigan Chamber of Commerce. This was in 1989 to 1990. It took them about a year from hearing the case to making the official ruling. And the argument was honestly pretty interesting. The Michigan Campaign Finance Act prohibited corporations from using treasury money for independent expenditures to support or oppose candidates in elections for state offices. So if a corporation sets up an independent fund designated for these political purposes, they can do that, but they can't just take out of any budget that they have and use it for these political broadcasts or political campaigns. The law was enacted with the assumption that the unique legal and economic characteristics of corporations necessitate some regulation of their political expenditures. They really just wanted to avoid corruption whenever talking about which money went where, specifically how money is spent. That's a common theme in today's discussion, is who is supporting these types of campaigns and broadcasts and how that money is getting spent, where it's coming from, etc. So the Michigan Chamber of Commerce wanted to support a candidate for Michigan's House of Representatives. They wanted to feature him in a newspaper advertisement, and that's basically where this entire case stems from, is they wanted to have a unique way of supporting a House of Representatives candidate. And so the big question for the Supreme Court was if the Michigan Campaign Finance Act violates the First and 14th Amendment, and they actually decided no. It was pretty controversial in the moment. It also stemmed around the type of corporation that was making these projects. The Michigan Chamber of Commerce tried to argue that it was a more nonprofit ideological corporation rather than a business firm, but this argument didn't really hold up for the Supreme Court, and the decision ended 6-3 in favor of Austin. So it was a pretty successful case, in my opinion. I think having different avenues to express your political advertisements is very helpful, and as we can see in the future, it has become so incredible. People have become so creative, and specifically on how politicized we are as a country, I think it's very important to be able to express your opinion even on like the official professional level, because if you're not able to do that, you're not able to be completely truthful with your audiences, and you're also not able to hear the opposing side's opinion on either your candidate or the other candidate. And it can be really impactful for determining who you're going to vote for, and not just voting based off of whatever party your family tells you to vote for. You're actually able to kind of make more of an informed opinion, which depends on the type of advertisement you see. But the next case that actually really dives into the logistics of political broadcasting is McConnell versus Federal Election Commission. This was in 2003, so about a decade has passed. And the argument for this case was that in early 2002, a many years long effort by Senators John McCain and Russell Feingold was to reform the way that money is raised for and spent during these political campaigns. So it was culminated in the passage of the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act of 2002. This is now going to be known as BCRA for the rest of this discussion. There were a few key provisions in this specific act, and the act actually has a lot of different implications for the current case that we're going to talk about last. So this is a really important act, and it had a few provisions. The first provision was a ban on unrestricted donations made directly to political parties. This was often by corporations, unions, just wealthy people in general. They banned these types of donations for political broadcasting, which is interesting, and we actually see the implications that that has later on. The next provision was limits on advertising that unions, corporations, and organizations can engage in up to 60 days before the election. So as it gets closer, just the types of things that you can say and do are going to get very limited. And finally, restrictions on political parties' use of their funds for advertising. I think that one's very interesting. Really, the common thread among all of these is trying to avoid corruption at all costs, basically. Or not at all costs, but at the most cost that you could possibly do in the political realm. A special 3-judge panel struck down portions of the Campaign Finance Reform Act. This was the act that we talked about in the first case. And so they struck down the ban on soft money donations, but they actually upheld restrictions on the kinds of advertising that these parties can engage in. So kind of going back on what they said about the money, but still upholding the regulations of the advertisements being created. And there were new viewpoints on political broadcasting, and really came down to which type of money is acceptable, which types of projects are acceptable. So there were a couple questions that the Supreme Court had to answer for this case specifically. And the first question was if the soft money ban on the BCRA exceeded Congress's authority to regulate elections. And the Supreme Court decided no, it doesn't. So Congress has a lot more of a say in the money that goes towards these types of advertisements. It's very interesting. If you hear some background noises, that's my cat. But it's very interesting to see that type of authority being brought to such a high power. Do regulations of the source, content, or timing in the Campaign Finance Reform Act violate the First Amendment's free speech clause? They also decided no on that. So the court found that such regulations were necessary to prevent groups from circumventing the law. One of the justices actually said that money is like water and it's always going to find an outlet. So, they were taking steps to prevent schemes and prevent different types of corruption going on in the political realm. They decided on a 5-4 ruling for the Federal Election Commission, and it really ties in both of the cases and has a really good middle ground. I think they're very detailed, very precise, but at the same time, kind of vague whenever it came to, okay, well, if you're going to have more restrictions and limitations on the types of advertising, what exactly are you limiting? So that question is very important, and it gets talked about into the crux of today's discussion, the final case. So these last two cases are going to serve as a precedent for the case that we're about to talk about. It's actually filled with a lot of tea, so let's go ahead and hop right into it. The case is Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission. This was from 2009 to 2010, and the argument actually stems from Hillary the movie. I don't know if any of you guys remember that being made. It's a very interesting discussion because it really kind of sets the bounds for new technology, what types of political advertising are actually allowed and which isn't. So the argument in and of itself was that Citizens United sought an injunction against the Federal Election Commission in the United States District Court for the District of Columbia to prevent the application of the BCRA from Hillary the movie. So they just didn't want to have the BCRA to be applied to their political movie. Their political movie. This very political act doesn't apply to our movie. And it was really interesting because the movie expressed opinions about whether Senator Clinton would make a good president or not. So you're literally giving your political opinion, providing a form of political broadcast. So in an attempt to regulate big money campaign contributions, the BCRA applied a variety of restrictions whenever talking about electioneering communications. So there are certain sections in the BCRA that were talked about in this court case. So I'm going to put them up here as I bring them up and whenever they are cross-applied. So Section 203 of the BCRA prevents corporations or labor unions from funding communication from the general treasuries. And Section 201 and 311 require the disclosure of donors to communicate a disclaimer. So basically saying, I am giving my money for this purpose. They have to say that if that money is going to be used for it. And Citizens United, that Section 203 violates the First Amendment whenever applied to the movie, and basically just arguing unconstitutionality, which is interesting because it's literally something that the Supreme Court said was constitutional, and that's what they decided. The United States District Court denied the injunction and said that it was not unconstitutional, and that in the court case of McConnell versus FEC, they already decided that and reached that determination. That's not something that's going to be changed. The district court also held that the movie was the functional equivalent of express advocacy. So yes, this is political speech, this is political advertising, this is political broadcasting. So there were a few questions that the court had to answer. They had to answer if McConnell resolved all constitutional as applied challenges to the BCRA. And they actually said no to this. And we're going to find out the implications of that answer in the next two questions that were asked. Do the BCRA's disclosure requirements impose an unconstitutional burden when applied to electioneering requirements because they're protected? The Supreme Court also decided no to that. And finally, should a feature-length documentary about a candidate for political office be treated like advertisements as issued in McConnell, and therefore be subject to regulation under the BCRA? The Supreme Court decided yes, it should. And I think that's a very fair ruling. Basically, what all of these questions and all of these answers mean for the case itself is hard to follow for someone who doesn't know a lot about legal talk, so let's go ahead and simplify it. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of Citizens United on a 5-4 decision. Many aspects of Hillary the movie were done correctly, and there were actually a few overrulings to the previous cases that we talked about. In Austin versus Michigan State of Commerce, they overruled the section that allowed prohibitions on independent expenditures. So the types of prohibitions on what types of money from like who that can send it, they kind of overruled that section. And in McConnell versus Federal Election Commission, they overruled that corporations could be banned from making electioneering communications. So while all of these things changed, at the end of the day, Hillary the movie was still put under the BCRA and still had to meet the requirements of the BCRA. So while certain precedents can be generally upheld and the general crux of the argument can be upheld, certain things do need to be changed, like electioneering communications. I mean, technology advances so far to the point where little things like that need to change. So overall, I thought that this case, while containing a lot of information, I think it was very interesting. I think that the Supreme Court was right in making the certain overrulings that they made, but also sticking by the BCRA because they did have a lot of really good and sound rules and regulations. So with all of that being said, if you guys have any questions, please let me know. I know I kind of went a little fast, but this was a lot of really good, really interesting information. Like I said, I'm going to place some visuals up here to help you guys follow along a little bit more, and I hope you guys enjoyed this discussion. Thank you.